Chapter 1, Vanishing Under Starlight. The prairie night was a restless thing, alive with the whisper of dry grass and the distant cry of coyotes. The moon spilled silver across the wide stretch of land, and the Monroe Ranch lay quiet, its fences casting long black shadows across the dust. Inside the ranch house, Caleb Monroe stirred awake, heart pounding though he couldn't say why. The bed beside him was cold. He sat up slowly, rubbing the grit from his eyes, listening. The silence was wrong, too heavy, too empty. Eleanor's side of the quilt was pulled back, the fabric cooling under the touch of his calloused hand. She was gone. Caleb swung his legs to the floor, boots finding where that creaked loud enough to betray his unease. He muttered under his breath, "Damn it, Ellie." The lantern on the dresser sputtered when he lit it, throwing amber light across the room. Her shawl lay crumpled near the door, as if dropped in haste. He stepped outside. The air was sharp and dry, smelling of dust and horses. The night pressing around him, wide and merciless. His eyes caught something in the dirt, a trail of faint footprints leading away from the house. Caleb crouched, fingers brushing the earth. Eleanor's boots. He knew the shape of her step, as well as he knew his own. The trail wound toward the barn. Every instinct in him stirred like a riled stallion. That barn had been the subject of too many whispers down at the saloon. Old men saying it wasn't just wood and nails, but a place where shadows gathered thicker than they should. Caleb had laughed at the talk then, but now, following his wife's trail, his throat tightened. He paused by the door, resting a hand against the rough timber. Inside, the lantern glow flickered low and strange, as if someone had tried to hide it. The silence was so deep he could hear his own heartbeat, steady as a war drum. Why would she come here at this hour? He eased the door open. The hinges groaned like a dying man. The barn smelled of hay and sweat. Underneath lingered something sharper, like smoke, like danger. Shadows stretched long across the dirt floor, and in the corner he saw movement, her dress hem vanishing behind the stall boards. "Eleanor?" His voice cracked the silence, low but heavy with demand. No answer, only the shifting of straw, the sound of breath not his own. Caleb's hand drifted to the revolver at his hip. His chest burned with a mixture of dread and something hotter, sharper, like jealousy stirring before he even had the proof to name it. The night outside was wide and star-flooded, but in here, under the weight of wood and secrets, the air felt close, thick, dangerous. He took a step forward, boots crunching the straw, and whispered her name again. This time the barn breathed back. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Barn. The lantern light swayed, throwing restless shadows against the barn walls. Caleb's boots ground into the straw as he moved deeper inside, every sense sharpened like the edge of a knife. His pulse drummed in his ears, heavy and merciless. He had spent a lifetime taming wild horses in harsher land, but nothing had ever set his chest aflame the way this silence did. And then he saw them. In the far corner, half hidden behind a stall, Eleanor was pressed close against a man Caleb didn't recognize. The stranger's coat was dust-stained, his dark hair falling loose over eyes that glowed like banked coals in the lantern haze. Eleanor's hand trembled where it rested on his chest, not in fear, but in longing. "Ellie!" Caleb's voice rasped, torn between disbelief and fury. She startled, lips parting as though she'd been struck. "Caleb, the words withered before she could shape them. The stranger turned slow, deliberate, like a wolf acknowledging another predator. "Didn't mean to cause no trouble," he said, his voice low, smooth, carrying the lazy confidence of a drifter who'd seen too many fights and feared none. His hand lingered at Eleanor's waist, and that was enough to make Caleb's blood boil. "Get your damn hands off my wife," Caleb snarled. His hand hovered near the revolver at his side, though he hadn't yet drawn. Eleanor stepped between them, eyes wide, desperate. "Please, Caleb, don't." Her voice cracked, soft as a broken string. "It ain't what you think." Caleb's jaw tightened, anger burning hotter, because he knew exactly what it looked like. Her flushed cheeks, the tremor in her breath. It wasn't fear for herself, but fear for the man beside her. The drifter chuckled low, a sound like gravel. Your wife's got a fire, rancher. Maybe you should have seen it sooner. The words hit like a lash. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, and for a heartbeat, he nearly drew on the man right then. But the weight of Eleanor's gaze pinned him. Guilt and yearning mingled in her eyes, enough to tear at him worse than any bullet. The barn seemed to shrink around them, lantern light breathing with every flicker. Caleb could smell Eleanor's perfume mingling with the dust, sweet and sharp, and it cut through him more than the sight of the drifter's hands ever could. "Ellie," he said again, this time softer, the fury in his chest wrestling with something more fragile. "Why?" Her lips trembled, words on the edge of spilling. But before she could answer, the drifter stepped forward, the scrape of his spurs against wood echoing like a warning. The night outside pressed close, coyotes wailing under the stars, as if the desert itself hungered for what would come next. Chapter 3. Dust and Gunpowder. By dawn, the whispers had already slithered into town. At the Silver Spur Saloon, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the sour stench of spilled whiskey, men leaned over poker tables, speaking low but sharp. Monroe's wife, one man muttered, tossing down a card with a smirk, slipped off with a drifter, right under his nose. Caleb pushed through the batwing doors just in time to hear it. The saloon fell into that uneasy hush that always followed him. The respect due to a man who'd worked his land with blood and grit, but now, laced with pity. He felt it in their eyes. Felt it like a noose tightening around his throat. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he made his way to the bar. His spurs sang with each step, sharp and steady. He didn't order a drink. He just stood there, shoulders rigid, jaw set. His silence was worse than a shout. A heavy laugh broke it. "Well, if it ain't the mighty Caleb Monroe," slurred Jeb Hawkins, a cowboy already 2 bottles deep. He staggered from his chair, whiskey dripping down his beard. "Heard your lady prefers a man who ain't afraid to keep her warm." The room tensed. Caleb's hand curled around the edge of the bar, the wood groaning under his grip. "Careful, Jeb," another voice muttered. But Jeb wasn't the careful type. He shoved forward, chest puffed, whiskey courage burning in his veins. "You hear me, Monroe?" Jeb spat, close enough now that Caleb could smell the sour liquor on his breath. "Ain't no shame. Women get restless when their men turn to stone." The words cut deep, not because they weren't true, but because they were. Caleb had built fences, wrangled cattle, fought drought and storm, but when Addie last looked his wife in the eye and told her she was seen, his silence cracked. Caleb's fist shot out, catching Jeb across the jaw. The man crashed into a table, cards scattering like broken promises. Chairs scraped, voices shouted, and the saloon roared to life. Jeb lunged, knife flashing in his hand. Caleb sidestepped, boots skidding across sawdust, and drove his shoulder into the man's gut. They tumbled hard, fists and curses flying. The crowd circled, hungry for blood, the old Wild West law spectacle ringing louder than any badge. Jeb rolled free, wild-eyed, and yanked his pistol. The metallic click echoed like thunder. Caleb drew in the same breath, his revolver gleaming cold in the lantern light. The 2 men stood locked, barrels raised, dust hanging thick in the air. "Drop it," Caleb growled, voice low, deadly. His hand didn't tremble. Jeb's lip bled, his pride wounded worse than his body. For a moment, the saloon was a church, every soul holding its breath. Finally, Jeb's pistol clattered to the floor. Caleb holstered his gun, chest heaving. The eyes around him burned with something he couldn't stand, pity, respect, fear, all tangled together. He shoved past them, out into the blinding light of day. The desert wind bit his face hot and dry, and Caleb knew one thing for certain. If he didn't claim his wife from the fire she'd stepped into, the West would chew them both into dust. Chapter 4. The Crossroads of Desire. The prairie night bled into a restless dusk. The sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gold. Caleb's boots struck hard against the dirt as he crossed the ranch yard, the day's heat still clinging to the earth. The barn loomed ahead, its roof line jagged against a fading light, and every step toward it felt like walking into a storm he couldn't outpace. Inside, lantern light glowed soft and low, swaying with the night breeze that sneaked through the cracks. Eleanor sat on a bale of hay, her dress dust-streaked, hands clenched in her lap. She didn't startle when the door creaked open. She knew it would be him, Ellie. Caleb's voice was gravel, ground down by fury and heartache. He shut the door behind him, the sound heavy, final. "Tell me what the hell I walked in on." Her head lifted, eyes shining wet in the dim light. "It ain't simple, Caleb." He stepped closer, jaw taut, fists coiled at his sides. "Simple enough. My wife, in another man's arms, out under my roof. Looks plain as day to me." Her breath hitched, but her chin rose with the stubborn fire he'd always admired in her. "You don't see me, Caleb. You see a cook, a housekeeper, someone to patch your shirts and keep the ranch fed. But you don't see me, not the woman I am." The word struck harder than any bullet. Caleb staggered back a step, shaking his head. "I work from sunup till dark to keep this land alive. Everything I've done, it's for you, for us. You built fences and dug wells," she said, her voice trembling. "But you built walls around yourself, too. You come home with dust on your boots and silence on your tongue. A woman can't live on quiet, Caleb." His chest tightened, the truth of it like grit in his lungs. He wanted to tell her he had always loved her, that every nail he drove, every steer he roped, was a prayer to keep her safe. But the words had never been his way, and now the silence he'd clung to stood between them like a canyon. He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers. "Ellie, I ain't good with words, but I can't lose you. Not to him." Her hand lingered in his, torn between the familiar calluses she knew and the wildfire promise Miguel had awakened. Tears welled in her eyes. "Then show me, Caleb, not with a gun, not with anger. Show me you still got a heart beating under all that dust." The lantern flame flickered, shadows breathing around them as if the barn itself held its breath. Caleb's throat worked, his heart pounding harder than in any gunfight he'd ever stood in. For the first time in years, he felt naked without a weapon, because here, against Eleanor's gaze, the only thing that mattered was truth. Chapter 5. Blood on the Horizon. The dawn broke crimson, bleeding across the horizon like a wound. The desert was still, save for the restless shuffle of horses in their stalls and the far-off cry of a hawk slicing the sky. Caleb stood outside the barn, revolver heavy on his hip, breath ghosting in the cool morning air. He knew this hour had been coming since the moment he saw Miguel's hand at Eleanor's waist. Eleanor stood between them now, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes swollen from a sleepless night. "Please," she begged, voice breaking against the silence. "Don't do this. Don't let the West law of blood be the end of us." Miguel stepped forward, spurs striking sharp against the hard-pan dirt. The early light caught the edge of his revolver as he loosened it in its holster. His dark eyes flicked from Caleb to Eleanor and back again, unshaken. "A man fights for what he wants," he said, low and steady. "And I reckon you're not the man she's been needing." Caleb's jaw locked, but his voice came quiet, like a storm rolling low across the plains. "You don't get to speak for her. You don't get to take what's mine." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, the word mine cutting sharper than steel. Her tears shone in the early light, but neither man moved. The dust of their boots stirred as the prairie wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dry sage and the heavy weight of what was about to come. They squared off, 20 paces apart. The barn loomed behind them, casting long shadows that stretched like specters across the dirt. Each man's hand hovered near his weapon, fingers twitching with the rhythm of their heartbeats. "Caleb," Eleanor whispered, but the word drowned in the silence. Time slowed. A crow cawed overhead, and in that heartbeat both men drew. The world exploded. Gunfire shattered the morning stillness, a crack that sent birds scattering into the fiery sky. Dust leapt from the earth, curling into the air as the smell of gunpowder rolled thick and acrid. Caleb staggered, his shoulders screaming with pain, but his revolver stayed raised, smoke coiling from the barrel. Miguel stumbled backward, a red bloom spreading across his shirt. He tried to steady himself, eyes burning with defiance, but his knees buckled and he crumpled into the dust. His revolver clattered from his hand. Forgotten! Eleanor's scream tore through the stillness, raw and unrestrained. She dropped beside Miguel, hands trembling as they pressed against his wound, though both she and Caleb knew it was useless. Caleb stood frozen, chest heaving, revolver heavy in his grip. His hand shook, not from the wound, but from the sight of Eleanor cradling the man who had nearly stolen her away. The sunrise stretched higher, merciless, casting the scene in a harsh, golden light. Blood stained the dust, smoke curled upward like a prayer unanswered, and in the hush that followed, Caleb understood. Nothing about this morning would ever be forgotten. Chapter 6, Embers of the Heart. The barn still smelled of gunpowder. Smoke clung to the rafters like a spirit that refused to leave, and the dust outside was darkened where Miguel had fallen. His body had been carried away by noon, but the echo of that dawn gunshot lingered over the ranch like a curse. Caleb leaned against the corral fence, his shirt torn and shoulder wrapped in a rough bandage. The land stretched endless before him, golden under the blaze of the sun, but he had never felt more trapped. His revolver lay holstered at his side, heavy as sin. Behind him, Eleanor's footsteps crunched on the dirt. She stopped a few paces away, the silence between them as wide as the prairie. Her shawl whipped in the wind, the same wind that carried the faint smell of blood, no matter how hard they tried to wash it away. "You didn't have to kill him," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to cut. Caleb didn't turn. His hand gripped the fence rail, knuckles white. He drew first. "That ain't what I mean," she whispered. "I mean the man inside you, the one who could have spoken to me, could have reached for me before I ever looked elsewhere." The words sliced deeper than any wound. Caleb bowed his head, jaw working as if he could grind the ache into silence. "Ellie, I've fought drought, wolves, rustlers. I thought keeping the ranch alive was the same as keeping us alive. I was wrong." His voice cracked, low and raw. "I should have fought for you." The wind sighed through the dry grass, carrying his confession into the wide, indifferent land. Eleanor stepped closer, her shadow brushing his. She studied him, the scars on his hands, the lines carved deep into his face, the storm still raging in his eyes. For the first time in years, she saw not just a hard rancher, but the man beneath, weary and afraid. Her fingers touched his arm, light as a breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Caleb," she said, honesty plain as the horizon. "But I know I can't forget you either." He turned then, meeting her gaze. Dust swirled between them, golden in the afternoon sun. For a moment, no words were needed. The hurt, the love, the longing all burned in her eyes like a fire neither of them could put out. Caleb reached for her hand, rough and trembling. This time, Eleanor didn't pull away. They stood at the edge of the prairie, scarred but side by side, the land stretching endless before them. The West was cruel, unforgiving, and hungry for blood. But in that moment, amidst the dust and danger, something fragile flickered to life. Not the old love, untouched and easy, but something new, born of fire and ashes. The embers of the heart. The sun dipped low, setting the plains aflame in gold and scarlet. The prairie wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of earth and smoke, the sound of a lone harmonica drifting faintly from the saloon in town. Horses shifted in their stalls, restless in the falling dark, their silhouettes carved sharp against the horizon. Caleb stood by the corral, hat in hand, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. The scars of the morning still clung to him, the bandaged shoulder, the weight of blood spilled, but his eyes, when they lifted, held something softer, something long denied. Eleanor stepped toward him, the hem of her dress catching dust, her shawl trailing like a banner in the wind. For a moment, they simply stood facing one another, the silence heavy with everything they had endured. "I thought the West had taken us," she said, her voice breaking like glass. "But maybe it was only waiting for us to fight for each other." Caleb reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. His words came low, steady as a heartbeat of land. "I can rebuild fences, Ellie, but this time I'll rebuild us first." Her eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with fragile hope. She stepped into him, pressing her forehead against his chest, the two of them framed by a sky burning itself into night. The prairie stretched endless, cruel, and beautiful, but for the first time they weren't facing alone.